The US has captured Nicolás Maduro and his wife and has taken them to face charges in the United States. What happens now? What might that mean for Venezuela and the world? Join me for this brief look at potential scenarios in the short to long term. With regards to Venezuela, there are 4 potential scenarios. Scenario 1. This is only a partial political decapitation and the Chavista regime remains in power. Trump has said that the US will control Venezuela for the foreseeable future until there can be no elections. But there seems to be no evidence that there are American troops that remain in Venezuela. Most of the Chavista leadership remains in the country, including Diosdado Cabello, who has been the second in command for years. Given how easy it was for the US military to get Maduro, it seems they might have had some sort of support within the regime, which at this early hour seems to have come from Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president. That could very well mean that there is some sort of deal where the Chavista regime retains power, while Trump gets his quote-unquote win without spilling any American blood. Justification, then, is that Maduro gets put in prison because he violated American law and not because he was the president of a foreign power with interests opposed to the US. What could the consequences of this be? This would be a massive problem for Venezuela and its people because none of the underlying problems the country faces would even be attempted to be solved. The only difference the capture of Maduro would bring would probably be that the remaining regime would be more cooperative with Trump and presumably would respond favorably to US demands, such as deportations and oil access, so long as Trump cared to maintain pressure, which is unlikely to last. This might happen even if internally, whoever the new leader was, remained rhetorically opposed to the US. So basically, a war status quo because nothing would change for the average Venezuelan, except now the country would have even less sovereignty. Scenario 2. There is partial decapitation, but no single Chavista maintains power, and the opposition has no way to actually gain control of the country, even if they declare themselves rulers of Venezuela. There are several potential Chavista leaders post-Maduro. Diosdado Cabello, Minister of the Interior, Padrino Lopez, the Minister of Defense, Delcy Rodriguez, the country's vice president. In the next days and weeks, we will find out if they are acceptable to the Trump regime and have enough support to remain in power. But if no one does, or if the opposition tries to challenge them, it could very well result in a civil war or prolonged anarchy. This is probably the worst case scenario. It would make a bad situation in Venezuela even worse, which in turn will lead to more refugees and more human misery for Venezuelans, but also their neighbors. How bad it could be depends obviously in how long it lasts, but even if it was only a year or so, rebuilding the country will be much harder than any of the other scenarios. Scenario 3. There's a complete decapitation of the Chavista regime through the prolonged use of the US military. Trump has said that he's not afraid of putting troops on the ground. Does that mean that the US will be occupying Venezuela in the next few weeks? If so, this is probably the scenario with the utmost downside for Trump, because it is one thing to get Maduro in a clean strike. It's much more difficult to occupy the country, even if tacitly supported by a majority of Venezuelans at first. This would be closer to the 19th century occupations of Nicaragua and Haiti. For reference, once American troops left, they gave rise to dictators. That would undoubtedly happen here too. So what are the potential consequences? This would be a huge threat to the entire region and is bound to revive leftist critiques of the US as an imperial power. But it will also empower both China and Russia's pretensions in Taiwan and Ukraine respectively. Scenario 4. There's a complete or almost complete decapitation in the following weeks and the opposition takes power with or without help from the US military. Either Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez take over through some sort of negotiation. This is the best case scenario of the 4 because it has the utmost potential, but it doesn't guarantee democracy or prosperity. Not least because in order for Venezuela to function again, a non-Chavista regime would have to regain complete control of the government capacity. And that is unlikely to happen in the short run because of how deeply entrenched the Chavistas are. But more importantly, control does not mean that the new government will have the capacity to put in necessary reforms. So even in the best case scenario, a Venezuela that starts growing again at a decent clip with a functioning democracy is a long shot. What is far more likely is a Venezuela that grows a little bit. It would be hard to replicate Chavismo's terrible economic record after all, with a dictator in charge, or a flawed democracy similar to El Salvador or Peru. With regards to the rest of the world, even if this was a complete success, this is a terrible precedent for the security of the world and international law. Best put by José de la Garza, a Mexican lawyer. He said, "To topple a dictator might be popular. Plenty of people will rejoice. But international law was not created to protect good or just countries. Rather, it was put in place to contain the powerful. That is why it bans the use of force almost without exception. Not because people should ignore injustice, but because as soon as any country decides to quote-unquote liberate with the use of force, the world goes back to the law of the mighty. The problem is not Maduro. The problem is that when military force is used to change governments without clear rules, the sovereignty of countries is no longer a limit, but rather a hindrance. Today is topple a dictator. Tomorrow it will be correct an election, protect someone's interest, restore order. International law cannot absolve dictatorships, but neither can it legitimize unilateral crusades. The real question is not whether a particular dictator should fall or not, but who decides when and how, because history shows something brutal. Getting rid of a dictator is easy compared to constructing justice or anything else. When legality is broken in the name of liberty, what follows is not freedom but chaos, violence, and new victims. International law exists for a reason, even when it is inconvenient. In other words, even if things work out for Venezuela, this attack should still be condemned. International law has been severely undermined in the past few years, and this is just another nail in the coffin. The consequences of that will be costly. In the meantime, as of right now, the most likely short-term scenario for Venezuela is the first. Will we get the fourth in the long term? That seems unlikely. But so did the US taking Maduro. We will just have to wait and see.